How's it going, everybody? Today we're going to be wrapping up the Vietnam War and looking at the last few events and years of the war, as well as the impact of the war on the larger Cold War, as well as on the U.S. as a whole. So, let's go ahead and get started here. So, we're going to start off by looking at kind of protests against the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is, like I mentioned last week, it coincides with the counterculture / hippie movement, and a lot of that has to do with the protest movements in the United States. It also coincides with a lot of the civil rights movement, which we'll talk about as well today. But these three periods really, the protest movement / hippie culture, the Vietnam War, civil rights movement, they all kind of come together, right? And we'll be looking at that today. Now, people had been protesting the war for a while, right? It wasn't a super popular war from the get-go, but protests were not massive. But then, as the 60s continued and the war became much bigger, there were more soldiers being sent there, and then we have the Tet Offensive, which was disastrous, if you guys remember from last week. This led to 68 being kind of like the watershed, the high water point of the war. Okay? So, many people were protesting the war because of the draft. A lot of the drafting policies were unfair. If you were poor or a minority, you were more likely to get drafted. If you were wealthy or had connections, you could either not get drafted or be given a non-combat role where you were much safer. And so the protests grew larger and larger. As American deaths started to pile on higher and higher, people continued to protest the war. So like I mentioned, there's kind of a few main causes of protest. Number one is the unfair drafting practices and policies. Number two are the atrocities committed by the U.S. troops during the war. And number three, we have declining faith in the U.S. government. So, the draft, okay, as I mentioned, there's a lot of protests against the draft. This was the era of the draft dodgers, people who would flee to Canada or other places to avoid being drafted. Not everyone did. Many people did get drafted. Some people actually wanted to go to war for a variety of reasons. But there was a very large anti-draft sentiment in the U.S. at the time. It was also known as the poor man's war, okay? When the Vietnam War began, here's a quote here, black soldiers made up 31% of all combat units. In 1965, they accounted for 24% of all combat deaths, a death rate 2.5 times proportion of the black population to the total U.S. population. Right, so black population in the U.S. is about 9 to 12%, right? And yet they made up 24% of the deaths in the war. Which shows that they were being given the much more dangerous roles, like being the people that would be first going into those tunnels and stuff like that. We also have atrocities like the My Lai massacre. So in the town of My Lai, there were supposedly some Viet Cong soldiers hiding out. Okay. Now, the day before, a bunch of U.S. troops were ambushed by some Viet Cong soldiers, and then they received information which turned out to be bad, which said they were hiding in this little town called My Lai. They eventually went into the town, and they basically just killed everyone, men, women, children, old people, young people, just everyone. And eventually photos and news of this massacre made it back to the U.S. and around the world, and that really did turn a lot of people against the war and against the U.S. for what they were doing in the war. Now, there were a lot of atrocities on both sides, but, you know, the U.S.'s rhetoric was that we were going in there and saving Vietnam from communism, but you can't really save a country or a people and then also commit atrocities like this, and so it led to a lot of protests as well. Similar protests were aimed at the use of napalm and Agent Orange, napalm being that sort of jellied fire that was dropped on the various jungles to burn it down and to kind of give the troops more vision. And then Agent Orange was a pesticide or herbicide, which was supposed to destroy the forests, again, to give the U.S. an upper hand in fighting the Viet Cong, but it also had a lot of negative health effects that were known at the time, but were still ignored. And so American soldiers as well as Vietnamese citizens were all subject to this this poison, essentially, this chemical, which had long-term effects on them. And here we see that famous photo again, a different shot of it, but that famous photo of the children running away from the napalm attack. The Tet Offensive, like I mentioned last week, was controversial because the U.S. had told people, right, they were telling people, hey, we've almost won the war, we're going to win the war, it's going to be done by Christmas, and then this happens, and it just shows that the war is far from over. And again, leads to people starting to doubt that what the government is telling them is actually true. Before the Vietnam War, people had a pretty high opinion, or at the very least a high level of trust in the government. Nowadays, that's been eroded for a variety of reasons, but this kind of starts with Vietnam, this kind of doubt as to whether or not the government is telling us the truth. And a lot of that has to do with the events of the Vietnam War. Following this same trend, we have the secret war in Cambodia. So when Nixon gets elected in 1968, he basically says, hey, we're going to end the war, right? But during his tenure as president, same with Johnson's as well. It started with Johnson. The U.S. was already bombing various sites in Cambodia, right? The Ho Chi Minh Trail, if you guys follow the mouse here, it went through Laos and Cambodia and kind of was constantly kind of branching in to parts of South Vietnam, but it went through Cambodia and Laos. And so the U.S. was bombing areas in these countries as well. Again, yeah, the North Vietnamese were using it, but we weren't at war with Cambodia or Laos, and many civilians and other people were also hurt by the bombing of these countries. The Pentagon Papers, basically this guy, Daniel Ellsberg, who worked in the government, essentially stole and leaked out these papers, which proved a lot of things about the Vietnam War. That the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was kind of made up to a certain degree. It showed that, we knew all these bad things were happening and we're ignoring them. It showed a lot of things, right? And so Ellsberg leaked these papers to the New York Times in 1971. The government tried really hard to get him. They encouraged people to break into his his psychiatrist's office to find information that he was like mentally ill or something, to discredit him. He was charged for treason, right? Eventually those charges were all dropped, right? But it was a huge bombshell, these papers, which kind of revealed that all along the government was lying to the American people, and they were hiding it, right? And so again, like I said, before this, a lot of people still had a lot of faith in their government, but this really did decline that. And it showed that they had been, they've been getting involved for 3 decades, right? Since the 50s, 40s and 50s, and yet, they had been lying to people about it all along. There's a series of protests. In 1967, we have a famous protest at the Lincoln Memorial in D.C., the Kent State and Jackson State protests, and then the Pentagon Papers being released turned into huge, massive protests. The Kent State and Jackson State were especially important. This is a photo from them because they were student protests at colleges. They turned violent, and the police started actually shooting at some of the students and killing some of them. This is one of those famous photos of a student who had been shot by the police at one of these protests. And the protests, right, the thing with protests is that's kind of like wildfire, right? They spread as they get bigger and bigger. And the police going in and shooting people only threw gas on that wildfire and made it even more, it made it a bigger deal, right? And so the protests grew and grew and grew. Like I said, they were protesting a variety of things: the killing of civilians, the draft, the unfair drafting policies. All these various things were parts of the student protests. And the 1960s, 50s and 60s was like kind of the beginnings of college being a more ubiquitous thing. It still wasn't, nowhere near like today. I mean, today, I don't know the exact numbers, but a lot of kids go to college, right? Back then, it wasn't expected nor really necessary to go to college to get a decent job. If you went to college, you were pretty guaranteed to have a good job. But this was kind of the beginning of a lot of young people going to college. And so you have all these, young kids. They're on their own for the first time. They're in college. They have similar mindsets, and the protests become massive during this time. And they're the ones who are targeted, right? They're the ones who would be going to war, right? If you went to college, you could get deferred from being drafted, but once college is over, you're going to war, right? And so for a lot of these kids, this was very real to them. So we have the election of 68, okay? So LBJ says he's not going to run. Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, gets assassinated in Los Angeles by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian extremist. And then that essentially divided the Democrats because one guy wasn't going to run, the other guy was dead. And so Nixon kind of took advantage of that, running as a Republican, and he wins in 68. Okay? So he wins in 68, and he wanted what he called peace with honor, basically saying like, hey, we're going to end the war, but we're not going to lose, right? No president wants to lose a war. That essentially means that they and their party won't get reelected, right? So his big idea was something called Vietnamization that he and Henry Kissinger came up with, which was the plan was to gradually pull out U.S. troops and then replace them with more Vietnamese soldiers that the U.S. would train. In reality, though, Nixon was kind of stalling and trying to find time for a knockout blow, right? So he was sending troops into Cambodia. He started bombing Laos, sending troops there as well, trying to find a way to win the war without having to give up on the war. Again, the Pentagon Papers, though, revealed this and essentially cut that short because now people knew what was going on. When the Pentagon Papers were released, set off the largest protest in U.S. history. 250,000 people, mostly college campuses, protested the war. People were killed at Kent State. It was a massive, massive thing. In 73, there was a ceasefire. The U.S. and North Vietnam agreed to a ceasefire. There was no peace treaty yet, but they withdrew troops from Vietnam. A lot of soldiers came home. This is a very famous photo of a soldier, a POW who was he was a pilot who was captured and kept in POW camp for many years. I think like 5 to 8 years in the POW camp. He was eventually released and got to see his family again. And so that was the end of the war, essentially, right? In 75, North Vietnam violated the ceasefire before a peace treaty was agreed upon, invaded South Vietnam, and unified the country under a communist government, essentially doing what it had been trying to do since the 1950s. Is Vietnam better? Not really. The 1970s were a horrible time for the Vietnamese. Hunger was high, poverty was high, people who owned land had their land taken away, people were sent to re-education camps, which were essentially concentration camps, people were killed. It didn't really help out Vietnam. But again, the Vietnam War was much more complex than just they're trying to be communist and we're trying to stop it, right? It was much more complicated than that. Here we see a quick timeline of the Vietnam War. Again, you guys can pause here and just kind of take a look so you can see how it kind of ramps up throughout the years. And there's a bunch of different presidents, right? It's Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson to Nixon, right? All these things, all these presidents kind of have their own take on the war and their own imprint on it, but none of them want to lose the war. Skip that. So, impact of the war. It was the longest and most divisive war in U.S. history. It was nothing like World War II, right? World War II, the soldiers coming home were the heroes, right? They defeated Nazi Germany, they defeated Hitler, they defeated fascism. They were greeted as heroes and treated as heroes. But of the 3.3 million U.S. soldiers who served, many were killed, many were wounded. But arguably, possibly one of the bigger tragedies was how they were treated when they came back, right? Over 15% were diagnosed with PTSD, which means that the number was probably much higher than that. Many faced hostility when they returned, right? Those college students that were protesting the war called the veterans, killers and blah, blah, blah. Which, again, it's much more complicated than that, right? It's easy to accuse someone of being a killer if they fought in a unpopular war, but they were drafted most of the time, right? They were given orders, so it's more complicated than either side would claim to be the simple view of it. Okay, it changed U.S. foreign policy. It ended containment because it kind of showed that there was a danger to containment, that it could bring us into these huge drawn-out wars. The USSR would have their own Vietnam and Afghanistan, which kind of also showed to them that trying to spread communism was not going to work to the same extent. And then Congress limited the president's ability to send troops without declaring war by passing the War Powers Act, right? A lot of what happened in Vietnam was tied to Johnson sending troops without congressional approval, and so Congress tried to limit that with the War Powers Act. People began to lose faith in the government during the Johnson and Nixon years. The cost of the war led to the lack of fulfillment of a lot of Johnson's promises and ideas of the Great Society. And then the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 years old because a lot of people said, hey, if I can't vote at 18, why can't I go get drafted and go get killed in a war? All right, so that's it for this lecture. What I'd like you guys to do is, you don't have to do a picture because it's hard to do online, but just for each of these things, I'd like you to just briefly, in a sentence or so, explain why is it important, okay, on your Google Doc. Do that, and then tune in to part 2 of the lecture, in which we'll look at the civil rights movement.